Okay, folks, let's continue on with chapter 21. Again, Renaissance in Quattrocento, Italy, 1400 to 1499. We are now going to move into the painting element of Florence, and a few contextual elements in regards to the paintings of this time is that um, a lot of them are going to still have Gothic like feels to them. Okay, Gothic feeling, Gothic style, the emotional aspects of coupling biblical parables and stories and narratives with emotions. Okay, the idea of surrendering heart to God, which is something that is very prominent in the medieval period. But there will be a few that are definitely going to kind of start to break away from that. Still using the Orthodox Christian themes and narratives, of course, but breaking away from the more of emotional aspect and finding new stylistic ways and compositional ways to develop rationality, coupled with this Orthodox Christian narrative and biblical tales. And the first to really do that and to start doing that is Masaccio, Masaccio. And he moved away from a technique that was being developed during this early Renaissance time called imitation and emulation. And what that really entails, which is something that was very Gothic or late medieval um, way of stylizing a composition or artwork through imitation and emulation, is that you imitate your teacher or master artist and then you emulate. And then once you imitate and then emulate, then you can start to stylize your own techniques, which are often characterized by a series of emulation and imitation. And an example of that is often when you take a painting course at a community college or in a university, is one of the assignments is to emulate or to imitate a master painter from antiquity or from the Renaissance or from a period, a certain period of time, either in the Renaissance or in Baroque or here or there. Okay, and that's part of that purposeful technique that was used in the Gothic period, the late medieval period, called imitation and emulation. And the artists at this time were doing that. Um, and Masaccio, excuse me, we're going to start with figure 21.18, the tribute money by Masaccio, is going to be one of the first to explore new territories and breaking away from this. You have to imitate and emulate as a student your master's work. Okay, I have an example of my graduate instructor in ceramics, not in painting, but when he wanted to, and his teacher was actually the father of Maya Lin, who did the Veterans Vietnam Memorial in Washington D.C. And his teacher in ceramics in Ohio at Athens University would not allow him to keep anything. It was a make on behalf in imitation and emulation of your teacher, and then everything that you make has to be disposed of. So it was a very similar type of master apprenticeship technique, and that's really what this imitating your master's work, and then your work should emulate, meaning when someone looks at your work, it should look similar to your master's style, and it gives homage and respect and such to your master teacher that you're learning from, which is great. But Masaccio during this time is going to be one of the first to break away, and Michelangelo is going to be another one who breaks away from this kind of imitation and emulation style, as well as Leonardo da Vinci. So with tribute money, is we're seeing that beginning of exploring new territories and breaking away from this emulation and imitational style that was a precursor to this Renaissance period in the medieval time. And with the tribute money, it is in the Brancacci Chapel in particular. And we call this a breakaway into new territory because nowhere does it show that Masaccio is learning in imitation from anyone else what he's doing here. And I'm going to break down exactly what he's doing. First of all, this is a fresco, and if you recall what a fresco is, it's the drying of plaster that's placed upon the wall, and then as it's drying, the pigmented oil or tempera is added into the wet, moist plaster, and then as it solidifies, it captures the pigment, seals it over with a crystalline, calcium crystalline structure. Excuse me. And then after it seals it over, it retains the vibrancy of the paint, and it's more long lasting. Okay, that's why a lot of these primary, or what are called first frescoes, are very vibrant. And then there's the secondary type of fresco, which is allowing the plaster to completely dry and then going in and painting on top of it, like a superficial skin of paint, which don't last as long. And we'll talk about Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, which is a secondary or a second type of fresco called a secco, S-E-C-C-O. That's why it's so deteriorated. But here with figure 2118, tribute money, it is a primary or a first fresco, meaning that the pigment paint was added while the plaster was still damp, still wet. So it is a fresco. It has three parts, and this is what's really a new advent and a new technique, and where Masaccio is discovering new territory. It's broken up into three parts, and that is the centralization of Jesus surrounded in a circular kind of composition by his followers, okay, which is something new, having this circular pattern instead of this linear pattern of association with Jesus being centralized. Here he's centralized, but there's a circle around him, which is very new. Then to the right of Jesus, where he's pointing, is a time lapse. All right, so he has three different activities. Masaccio has three different activities time lapsed, implying time and implying motion. So you notice that Jesus is pointing to his right, and he's pointing at Peter, and Peter is pointing towards the river, and it looks at first as if he's pointing at somebody who's gathering from the water. Well, in the biblical story, it is Peter who actually is the one who goes to the water. Jesus tells him there's a coin within the mouth of a fish, because the tax collector is to Jesus's left with his back facing us, asking for a tax to be able to advance and enter the town. So Jesus tells Peter, go to the water, there's a coin in the mouth of fish. He opens the fish. So that scene to the far left of us and to the far right of Jesus is Peter gathering the coin from the fish's mouth. Okay, so it's two different scenes showing A, the first action is the center, B, the second time lapse action is to the far left, where Peter's gathering the coin. Okay. Then third, C, the last chronological activity, is to the far right, our far right, which is Peter giving a little reluctantly the tax to the tax collector. So Peter is featured in three different parts of this one composition, which is a total new territory altogether, something that was never considered before. All right, it might have been dabbed in, but this was like very prominent, very new, very rich, and very powerful. All right, so we have the centralization of Jesus in this concentric circle of his followers around him. The tax collector has no religious connection or spiritual or divine connection to Jesus. You can see he has no halo around his head, and his back is facing us, which is a symbol of irreligiosity. Is whenever you focus on the back, it's often you're focusing on the irreligious activity of the individual. Okay, so that's one thing. Then we have to our far right the action of Peter, who is by Jesus in the center, his direct right, pointing towards the water, gathering the coin, and then lastly, all the way to the far right, giving the coin to the tax collector. Okay, this is breaking up the composition and the story into threes without it having different panels on the side, like what we saw in the last chapter with the altar pieces. They have two panels on the side and one center panel, which is a triptych. It's all incorporated into one painting, which is very new. It's a new technique altogether. All right. Another thing is that there's going to be more modeling of the figure. And what that means is that there's going to be more of a shift, and also in the fabric, from light to dark. And we're going to get more specifically into what we mean by that when we talk about Leonardo da Vinci. But it is an attempt to show value shift between light and dark. And the light source is coming from the far right. That's why there's more light on the building, because that's where a light source is. So what I'm saying is Masaccio is now starting to play with a focal point of where the light source is coming from. And that is to the far right, which is where Peter is giving the coin to the tax collector. Then everything else in the composition is unified by this one light, even though there's three totally different scenes happening at one time. All right. So this is going to be a new characteristic of painting as well. And it's called modeling the figures. And you model the figures based off of a light source. The area that's not focused towards the light will be dark, and the area that is in the light will be lighter. All right. And it's called modeling the figure, the physical features. There's also a psychological element to it. So psychology is being studied at this time, and it's going to be studied even more and more during the high to late Renaissance, and the artwork is going to really imbibe a sense of psychology. And it's not an emotional element, it's a psychological element, a mental, idealistic element of what is happening in the minds of each individual. Okay, they're focused, they're rational, but they're also all thinking a little differently. So all the followers and the disciples of Jesus have a different type of psychological glance or focus upon Jesus and his directive, which is, Peter, go gather the coin in the fish's mouth and give it to this tax collector. All right, and Peter's act is a little physical in nature in gathering that of the coin from the fish, and then a slight reluctancy to the taxpayer. But there's a little bit of humbleness in the exchange as well to the far right. And that's the psychological aspect. So looking at Peter in particular in his three different psychological elements, like Jesus telling him, Peter, coin is in the fish over there by the water. And he's like, are you sure? That way, correct? And he's like, he goes over there. He does it. He doesn't ask, really. He gathers the coin, and then he reluctantly gives it to the tax collector. So three different types of psychological, mental changes of thought. So it's very much about thought. We talked about the light source for more figure and natural modeling. I already discussed that. And then how the artist is directing that light coming from the far right of the composition whenever we're looking at it. We talked about the circular configuration in a large landscape. There's no border either. If you recall in the panels in the altarpieces that we saw in the last chapter, there were a lot of borders around, or architectural borders, or actual framed wooden borders around the panels. Here it's completely open. There's no architectural border. There's a few pillars on the right and the left, but there's no border on top and there's no border on the bottom. It's more of a continuous kind of fill in the blank, if you will, with your own imagination on how far that landscape goes. The landscape is open. It's atmospheric behind Jesus. It's not within architectural confinement. It's still very much open, and we call that kind of an aerial perspective, if you will. So it's not bordered. The building is focusing on some type of linear perspective, okay? And that linear perspective is there, and that architecture is there to give centralization of Jesus. Again, you have the circularization of composition of his followers around him, which is centralizing him. But by it being in this open atmospheric environment, there needs to be some element of composition in linear perspective to show the parallel lines moving down towards that vanishing point. And that vanishing point in this composition of tribute money is at Jesus's crown. It's at his head, where his halo is. So all the angles that are coming off of that architecture behind Peter and the tax collector to the far right are all angling down towards Jesus's head, which again is a subliminal or a subtle way to give a focal attention to Jesus as the core central figure of this biblical story. Okay? All right, so that's tribute money. And now what we're going to do, let's see what our time looks like. Okay. We are going to jump down to figure 2120, which is the Holy Trinity. Again, by Masaccio. 2120. You can see the linear perspective, all right? You're starting hopefully at this point to see how all of those angles and those side views of anything that's rectilinear or nature or anything that's curved or rounded, like the barrel vault system that we have in the background behind God, who's behind Jesus on the cross, is all leading down to a vanishing point. And again, where do you think that vanishing point might be? It's a little different. I want you to think about it as I'm talking about it on where it might be, and I'm going to tell you exactly where it is here in just a little bit. So it is using that linear perspective, and remember that is called rationalization of sight. That's what they're terming linear perspective to be. Rationalizing what you see. Okay? Linear perspective. The Greco-Roman aspect is the use of that barrel vault. Okay? I don't know how many of you have done Art History 141 or have discussed it or know much about the Roman barrel vault system, but it is part of that Greco-Roman influence that's coming into this type of Renaissance work and the Renaissance painting. So you can see with Masaccio, he's breaking away from a lot of the medieval techniques as he's moving into these Greco-Roman rebirth of antiquity, like the sculptors like Donatello was doing prior to this discussion of Masaccio. And the barrel vault is a vault system that's an archway that is a continuous sprung arch that goes all the way back and creates a tunnel. It's called a barrel vault. It was originally used in the catacombs and in burial chambers and subterranean, but then the Romans during the Roman Empire brought it up to the surface and started building all of their temples and architectural features with this barrel vault system. And there's a whole bunch of different derivatives from this singular barrel vault technique. That's one of the Greco-Roman influences that we see here. It is a two-tiered painting, all right? It's two-tiered because you have the Holy Trinity up above, but then you also have a lower tomb aspect in the bottom. So we're seeing with Masaccio's The Tribute Money a three implied time painting, and now here he is playing with a two-tiered section. So you have a top 2/3, which is the Trinity, and then you have a bottom third. And that's going to be important in regards to where the vanishing point is. So he's playing with compositional proportions and implied time, which is something that we really didn't see in painting prior to Masaccio's advents. A little bit with shoot, I forgot. I'm not going to go on a tangent anyway, but this is where we really see it very, very prominent. Darn it, forgot the name. Anyway, here we are with Masaccio. Okay. Now, one thing is we're going to start to see, like we saw with the Flemish painters back in the previous chapter, is the presence of the patrons, the ones that are commissioning this Holy Trinity, this mural. Again, this is a fresco, so it's not a religious commissioner. It is actually a mercantile commissioner, and the patrons are in the Florence robes. So sitting on the ledge to the left in the red is the main patron, and his counterpart and his partner, his wife, is on the other side, balancing out the Holy Trinity in this symmetry. Okay, so their presence is there. They're not in the middle ground, where the Holy Trinity and the crucifixion is happening, but they are on the out. They are in the foreground. Okay, so they're present, but they're not in the biblical activity or narration, but they are present observing it. Again, this is something that the Flemish did, showing the patrons observing the biblical stories, okay, incorporating them, showing that they're that devoted to the biblical Christian stories that they are being included in the painting, because they're paying big money as patrons to have this done. So I'm hoping that you figured out where this vanishing point might be following the lines in the barrel vault. It's going down past the body and the head of Christ on the crucifix, or being crucified, and it's at his feet. The vanishing point is at the foot of the crucifixion. It's at his feet. All right. And what that does is it creates an importance in the two different tiered sections. Instead of the vanishing point being high or in the middle of the composition, it's down low below the middle. And that gives emphasis in the bottom, which is a resurrection symbolism with the skeleton in the tomb at the bottom. And it's supposed to help indicate that lower section, that lower tier, faith in Jesus. And from faith in Jesus comes the rising from death to resurrection. Okay? And so by using these different humanistic mathematical techniques of linear perspective, it focuses at the feet of Jesus, which is the devoted place of worship from his followers. And there is the core focal point at his feet, but it also gives emphasis to the lower tier below the patrons with the tomb, that's showing that from death there is resurrection. There will be hope. There will be faith. Okay, so it speaks to the new scientific aspects of humanism using certain compositional techniques, coupled with the religious narrative of faith will overcome any obstacles. Okay, so it's still both religion and science combined, kind of like the science of religion, so to speak. All right, so that is Masaccio. Let me quickly touch base with Botticelli and the Birth of Venus. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to have to go back to the original piece, which is figure 21.1. 21.1. And what's really big about Botticelli's Birth of Venus is that we're first finally seeing polytheistic gods, Venus. All right? We are not looking directly at a Christian theme. We are actually looking at Venus, which is a Roman name for Athena, or God, the mother of the gods, Venus. Okay, so there is a direct classical theme that's coming from those Greco-Roman stories. Okay, it's not a theme coming from the Bible, but there will be subtle innuendos of the importance of biblical conclusions from this Greco-Roman influence of tale and story. Okay, it will ultimately be about the importance of the Bible, but they're using imagery from Greco-Roman times, antiquity, to get to that point. Let me explain. So what this theme is supposed to be showing is love of God, and moving away from lust and violence of the Zephyr to the clothed island of reason and faith. So what that means is, to the far left, our far left of the composition, is the lusty, wild, aggressive, irrational nature of what was deemed polytheistic, paganistic, all these different wild and irrational thoughts blowing Venus, but she's moving away from him. You can see she's leaning away from the Zephyr on the far left, which is a Western Zephyr, and she's moving into, or leaning into, where she's going to be clothed. All right. And where she's going to be clothed and she's finally cladded in cloth, we call that a primavera. It's called a primavera. When you've come from a place of irrationality and heightened emotion and you move into a place of reason and faith and truth, and you're cladded in cloth, that's called a primavera. So though it is a Greco-Roman narrative, it is showing that through biblical devotion with Christianity, you become cladded and clothed, and you become reasonable, and you become faithful and dawned in truth. Okay, so that's a real big important narrative behind Birth of Venus. Now, a few other things you can see. She has that contrapposta, just like we saw with St. Mark, just like we saw with Donatello's David. She has that bend in the leg, the shifting of the hip to one direction, the twisted of the upper body, creating that implied S curve, that sine curve. All right? So there is that Greco-Roman sensualism that's still present, and the obvious nudity. And Botticelli is going to be the first since Greek with the Venus Aphrodite sculptures. Aphrodite, I'm sorry, not Athena. Aphrodite is the counterpart to Venus. So Venus is the Roman name, Aphrodite is the Greek name. But it's going to be Botticelli who's going to bring back the first nude woman. All right. Donatello was the first to bring back the first nude male that did not connect to Adam and Eve or any of the nude biblical tales. The David was not nude in the biblical tale. Donatello was the first to show him nude for Greco-Roman reasons. And now here, Botticelli, Venus is being portrayed as nude. But she's going to be cladded in reason and truth and faith, which is the end conclusive product of the piece. Okay? And you can see that with the counterpart to Birth of Venus, figure 21.1. And you can look to painting, find it, 2128, Primavera, spring. Here, she's cladded. She's robed. And she's stepping away from all the irrationality and moving towards reason because of biblical stories, because of biblical Christian devotion. So though it is a Greco-Roman story, it is showing that from her understanding of the Bible, she is moving away from that. Okay? Again, coupling the two. So a couple other things within this. There is still a little bit of a Gothic medieval feel. I've talked a lot about the Greco-Roman, but the Gothic medieval feel is what are called allusions and mythos. That's what these are by the Venus story. It is a mytho. And they were flat and devoid of linear and atmospheric perspectives to show charm and romance. So if you look at both of these paintings, Primavera, Spring, 2128, and then also 21.1, the Birth of Venus, they are flat. There's not a really, when it comes to action and spatial recession with the figures, a middle ground or a front ground, a middle ground, and a background. They're all on the same plane. All right? Which is still very a Gothic romantic charm. And that's what we're seeing here, is that Botticelli, even though he's very interested in these classical tales and he's incorporating them, there's still a flatness and a representational flatness to the scenes. And be able to know that there's still a slight tinge of Gothic medieval touch and style to both of these paintings, figure 21.28 and figure 21.1. All right? Okay, I'll leave you with that, and then next we'll get into architecture, and then we'll finish up with chapter 21. All right, see you soon.